All right, ladies, now we are going to start the major event of our year. It has built up to this moment. We're starting the Civil War. We're going to look at section one, preparing for the war. Real quick with the portrait in front of us, I just want to highlight a couple things. First, on the left side, we have the Union in blue. You'll know them as the men in blue. On the right side, we have the Confederate States soldier in gray. And later on, when we go to Gettysburg, they'll be referred to as the blue and the gray. Now let's move on. First, we're looking at our objective for this lesson. We're going to explain the impact the attack on Fort Sumter had on the Civil War. Next, we'll identify the reactions to Fort Sumter by the North and the South. Finally, we'll explain the Union's plan to winning the war. The fall of Fort Sumter. Shortly after 1861 started, in April to be exact, the Confederate States began to move on Fort Sumter. That's a U.S. fort that was located in South Carolina. Now, they wanted all of the weapons that were inside of it, and they wanted the fort itself. And they gave the United States an ultimatum. Get out, or we're going to get you out. Now, Lincoln doesn't want war. And he waits and waits and waits. And the Confederacy eventually follows up on its ultimatum, and they attack Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861. This is essentially the first battle of the Civil War. Now here's a portrait of the Battle of Fort Sumter. As you can see across over here, we have all the cannons firing around, and Fort Sumter looks like it's been damaged really bad. And in reality, it was. Fort Sumter was pretty much destroyed following this. Now, the Confederacy will use the fort for major events in the war following the fall from the Union Army, but for all intents and purposes, they did a pretty good job of destroying their own military fort. Now let's look at the outcome of the battle. Confederates will win this, as I just mentioned, pretty easily, and the Union soldiers will become prisoners. No one actually dies in the battle except a Union horse. Now for the battle, this is going to be something we do throughout the course of the Civil War, and we're going to look at the generals of the battle. They'll be looking at the Union generals, and we'll be looking at the Confederate generals. In this case, the Union general was Major General Robert Anderson. For the Confederacy, it was P.G.T. Beauregard. Now we have both men here laid out in front of you. On the left, we have P.G.T. Beauregard of the Confederate States of America. Notice he's in his gray uniform. On the right, we have Major General Robert Anderson of the United States of America in his blue uniform. Just a little bit of a tidbit on these two individuals for you guys is Robert Anderson was actually an instructor. He was a field artillery instructor at West Point. And when he was the instructor, he had a teacher's assistant. And his teacher's assistant did such a good job, he kept him on for another year after his graduation to be his assistant. His assistant was P.G.T. Beauregard. So in this case, you had the student fighting the teacher and defeating the teacher. This is really one of those small tidbits that where the Civil War was filled with, and that makes it absolutely an interesting and fascinating topic. Now, in response to Fort Sumter, Lincoln calls for 75,000 troops. He wants to put together a Union army that puts down the rebels. Now, the Southerners take this as a threat because they think Lincoln is going to take this army and invade their home country, their newly christened home country, the Confederate States of America. Now, Alexander Stephens says he is the vice president of the Confederacy. Lincoln may bring his 75,000 troops against us. We can call out 1,000,000 peoples if need be, and when they're cut down, we'll call out another. So this is just the bravado I want you to see about how the Confederate States worked in this war. They were willing to go toe-to-toe with the United States to protect their homeland. Now, I want to show you two recruitment posters that take place in 1861. On the left side, we have a Northern recruitment poster. Look at the language that's used there. Patriots, your country needs you. The Union forever. That's the theme of the Civil War in the early years, guys. Lincoln wants to keep the Union together. Now, on the Confederate side, repel the invasion. You have an invading army from the North coming down south. This poster tells us what we want to see there. That's what they thought. They thought that a terrorist invading army was coming down to their homeland and they needed to protect it at all costs. Now, moving on. The border states. We want to talk about them for a while because we know exactly who the North was and we know who the South was. But these states that were right in the middle of the North and the South were really vital to the Union. Starting with Maryland. Maryland had anti- and pro-slave forces. Now, Maryland was more strategically important because of its location to Washington, D.C. If the Confederacy took Maryland, they would have an easy path to Washington, D.C. and potentially take down President Lincoln. Next, we have Missouri. Now, Missouri itself is a border state, but doesn't really offer any strategic advantage in the war. The only reason that it's included within this list is that the people themselves voted for anti-slave forces, yet the government themselves were pro-slavery. And I want to show this to you only because it shows the divisions of the people within the state. That the government can be so pro-slavery, yet the people can be so anti-slavery. That's what the Civil War is all about. That's why we call it the Civil War. It's a fight on brother on brother. Next, we have Kentucky. Now, this was arguably the most important border state. Kentucky's location right by the Ohio River made it a strategic advantage in using the Ohio River to navigate certain things that were needed to run war. Troops, supplies, or just controlling waters to take away the opportunity from your enemy. Now, Kentucky was actually neutral, and they remained neutral until the Confederacy tried to take over the state. Because they tried to take over the state, the members of the state felt that as an insult and said, you know what? We're just going to side with the Union. The Union's going to offer us protection, and they weren't going to threaten our sovereignty. And as such, the Union ended up controlling Kentucky, which was the very state that Lincoln wanted to control. I'd like to show you guys the border states right here. Now, as we can see, the Confederacy is clearly broken up in this angle. All of the states are conveniently labeled for you. So if you want to take note of who they are, I would suggest pausing right now, take note of who the Confederate states were, who the border states were, and who the northern states were. Now, I'm just going to focus on the border states for a moment. Take a look at Missouri we have right here. South of Iowa, north of Arkansas. Next, we have Kentucky. Now, this is the strategic border state because we have Ohio, and the river will run right through Kentucky and into Tennessee. Control of that body of water would be vital for both sides. And we have West Virginia, who conveniently splits from Virginia during the Civil War because they want nothing to do with slavery. Now, moving on. The goals and strategies of the war. For the North, preserve the Union. That's the goal. For the South, protect our homeland. The North strategy is called the Anaconda Plan. Imagine a snake wrapping itself around its prey, and then it squeezes till its prey dies. Well, that's exactly what the North's plan really was. Now, to do it, they were going to use a naval blockade all along the watered coast. So we have the Atlantic Ocean on the east coast and the Gulf of Mexico on the southern coast. Now, on the inside, they were going to cut everything off using the Army, controlling strategic locations. Now, here's a visualization. It's kind of a caricature making fun of the Anaconda Plan. See the naval blockade. All of this would go around, so the South wouldn't be able to use any of their shipping assets. So they wouldn't be able to sell their cotton, and they wouldn't be able to gather reinforcements. Now, on land, though, the military, the Army that is, would come in all through these states and try to control the areas to prevent the Confederacy from aiding one another to run war. Ultimately, we'll look at more maps that cover war strategies because the goal is going to be to end up dividing the Confederacy. And we're going to talk about that much later. For the South, strategy is simple. Protect the homeland. Hold out long enough for any one of the following to happen. First, England and France will acknowledge the Confederacy. If they do this, the United States of America has no other option but to acknowledge the Confederacy. What the Confederacy has been looking for is legitimacy. They want to be recognized as a nation. Second, if Lincoln loses the election in 1864, it's very likely the person he'd lose to would allow the southern states to remain seceded and allow the Confederacy to live on as its own nation. Now, ladies, your homework. Rewatch the video. Take notes on the following: the events of Fort Sumter, the reaction to Fort Sumter. What does Lincoln do in response to Fort Sumter? What do the Confederates do in response to Lincoln's actions? What were the northern strategies? What's the southern strategies? All of this needs to be prepared for tomorrow's class. When you get in tomorrow, bring your textbook. I want you to bring your textbook. I will say this one more time. Bring your textbook tomorrow. Ladies, thank you very much and have a great evening.